Hello and good afternoon. I'm John Campbell, the BBC's Economics and Business Editor in Northern Ireland. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 60th anniversary of Housing Rights. Housing Rights is the leading specialist provider of advice, information and training on housing and homelessness issues. This charity was established in 1964 and works to improve lives by tackling homelessness and housing problems. I think what we want to do today is to reflect on the work and the struggle, past and present, to acknowledge that there's so much to be proud of, but it's also about preparing to go again, to tackle the many obvious problems which remain. If we cast our minds back to 1964, a time when really many of the people in this room were not even born, there were other significant birthdays. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, the actor Keanu Reeves, the footballer Marco van Basten. Housing Rights also shares a 60th anniversary year with a couple of politicians, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. Very sadly, they could not join us today. But our own Minister, Gordon Lyons, will be speaking very shortly. I think it's also worth painting a picture of the sort of world that existed in 1964. Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment in that year. The Cold War dominated international relations. There was still a hot war raging in Vietnam, and the UK was in the process of winding down its empire. Back home, the cracks were starting to show in this society, and housing would become a major catalyst for a broader civil rights movement. This was before the Housing Executive even existed, and it fell largely to volunteers to help people deal with the widespread levels of very poor housing, and there was very little joined-up thinking about housing and homelessness. And a little later, we'll hear more about the history of housing rights from its earliest days from Rose Crozier. Now, obviously, a whole lot has changed in the last 60 years, but wasn't it striking how yesterday morning the BBC's airwaves were dominated by a housing issue? One which could have been told at almost any point over the last 6 decades. A family who had lost their tenancy in their private rented home and had been rendered homeless with all the stress and trauma that comes with that. My colleague Richard Morgan told the story of Martine Courtney and her family who have been bouncing from hotel to hotel against the backdrop in an explosion for demand in emergency accommodation. And of course, our coverage contained a contribution from Housing Rights as the go-to organisation for journalists seeking an explanation of housing stories. And that coverage also featured the UN rapporteur who's with us here today. Just a reminder that this event is being recorded. Please tweet or X or whatever you call it nowadays about what you hear. The hashtag is Housing Rights 60. Just to take you briefly through today's running order, we will shortly have an address from Minister Lyons, then Rose Crozier on housing rights history. We will bring it right up to the present day with contributions from Rachel and Jenny, peer advocates who've been working with housing rights to use their experiences to help make things better for other people. We'll follow that with the keynote from the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, Mr Balakrishnan Rajagopal. Chief Executive Kate Macaulay will be telling us what comes next for housing rights in the context of the new strategic plan. Kate and Balakrishnan will then join me for a bit of a chat and answer some of your questions. And finally, we will have the launch of the Housing Rights 60th Anniversary book, edited by Sharon Muldoon, and then we can drink some wine. But firstly, we are in this building today by the graces of our event sponsor, Ciara Ferguson. She's an MLA for Foyle and is the Deputy Chair of the Assembly Communities Committee, as well as Chair of the All-Party Group on Homelessness. And Ciara will say a few words of introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone here and to celebrate and mark 6 decades of human rights and to launch the organisation's new strategic plan for the next 5 years. And obviously I wasn't born in 1964, but I was someone who was born in 71 and lived, and I was fortunate to live in and be brought up within social housing, within a social housing estate, and it was the best days of our life, and that's where the community supported and worked together collectively. So we know how critically important homes is to our families and the need to build more social homes. I would like to also thank my co-sponsors for this event, Kelly Armstrong, MLA, and Harry Harvey, MLA. And we wish to welcome the Minister for Communities, Gordon Lyons, here today, our Housing Rights CEO, Kate McCauley, and Housing Rights Chairperson, Rose Crozier, who are all present here today. I would also like to thank many more in the room who will contribute to today's discussion and for dedicating their lives, and in particular their work, to the improvement of housing provision and conditions and the prevention of homelessness within our society. I think I would also ask you all to join me in offering a particularly warm welcome and a round of applause to our special guest here today, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. Utilising his own legal background, he decided to work for the protection and advancement of human rights, including economic, social and cultural rights, notably the right to adequate housing as enshrined in the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. We are all very grateful to have you and your wealth of experience and expertise with us here today. Housing, as we all in this room are well aware, is one of the most fundamental human rights, providing shelter, comfort and security. It should also afford personal dignity, a space for privacy and a foundation for so many other aspects of our personal and our family life. The right to housing should be progressively realised, meaning it should be continuously improved. However, as we're all too well aware, between 2007, 2008 and to the 31st of December 2023, the number of households in housing stress has increased here dramatically from over 21,000 to over 34,500. Similarly, as of January 23, we have over 4,500 households living in temporary accommodation here, an increase of 121% on January 2019. And within my own council area in Foyle, you can take an example like the cost of temporary accommodation, as I'm sure our departments and our housing executive here are well aware of, has risen from £2.5 million to over £5.5 million in my own constituency in 2002 or 22-23. So we're well aware this right to housing should also be exercised equally. As yet, we recognise there is a continued mismatch between the supply and demand of social housing, particularly in areas of housing need, such as Derry and Belfast. A commitment to the area of housing and homeless prevention and to support our housing and homelessness organisations who we would be lost without, to be honest, over the last 60 years, and the many other organisations that provide such vital work and compassionate work and person-centred work to support our most vulnerable in society. And we need to ensure that across our executive and the opposition and other parties that we work collectively together to support you as organisations as well in your work. I'm also going to keep this brief, but first of all, I want to have huge congratulations to the team at Housing Rights on their noteworthy 60th anniversary. As Sinn Féin's sixth county spokesperson on housing, and within my role as chair of both the All-Party Group for Homelessness and the All-Party Group for Housing, I've worked closely with the team at Housing Rights on a variety of issues, and I've always loved attending their events and their seminars, and particularly bringing those we lived experience into the room and having those conversations have been critically important. It should be acknowledged that their policy experts provide significant support for the committee for communities during the legislative development, in particular of the Private Tenancy Act, in which I've been involved in. The advice and advocacy services provided by Housing Rights has undoubtedly been a lifeline for many in our society, acting as a support for housing access and tenancy sustainment. And in relation to, obviously, it's great that we have our Minister for Communities here today, who I am urging that they prioritise, and I urge him every time he is in the Assembly and any time he comes to the committee, prioritise the prevention of homelessness, the revitalisation of the housing executive and the delivery of much needed social and affordable housing at scale, and additional reforms to improve affordability, community-led developments, energy efficiency, housing standards and security of tenure. As we're well aware, the latest index of the Housing Price Index report indicated that monthly rent stood at £850 between July and December 23. That's 9% higher than in the same period in 22. They acknowledge that the overall picture is of a pressurised rental market with supply exceeded by demand. The Department for Communities has a key role to play in this request. We know that without delivery on social and affordable housing, many of our rural, urban and coastal communities are at risk of becoming lifeless. This must be an area of priority throughout the rest of this mandate and beyond, not only for the Minister for Communities, but for the Executive and each and every one of our MLAs that are here today. To conclude, I just want to reiterate my thanks to everyone present here today and to wish Housing Rights every success with their work in delivering their new work plan. I am grateful to have had the opportunity to sponsor today's event, and I look forward to continuing to work closely with them and all colleagues within the Department of Communities. And I would now like to welcome the Minister for Communities, Gordon Lyons, MLA, to give his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would also like to put on the record that I was not born in or before 1964. I'm also glad that I got a better welcome than whenever the names Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage were mentioned. I hope that's still the case at the end of my, what I hope to be 3 years in this job. It is great to be here today to celebrate what really is a remarkable milestone of Housing Rights and their 60th anniversary, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to address you today. And I am delighted, on behalf of the Northern Ireland Executive, to have this opportunity to publicly thank you for the invaluable service that you provide to the people of Northern Ireland. Thank you very much. The attendance of so many people here today is testament to the exceptional service that you provide. And a special thank you to Mr. Raja Gopal for our very insightful conversation earlier today. Our conversation shed light on the housing challenges that we face here in Northern Ireland, but also highlighted areas in which I believe that we can learn from each other as well. Having a problem with your home or being threatened with homelessness is enormously stressful. And any MLA will tell you that it is the #1 issue in our constituency offices. And Housing Rights play a vital role in supporting individuals and families through the most challenging of circumstances. You offer guidance and advice when people are at their most vulnerable, as well as legal representation and advocacy. The impact of your services and the difference that they make for people in despair cannot be overstated. Reflecting on the rich history of Housing Rights, it's inspiring to think how it has grown and evolved over the last 6 decades. From serving just a few hundred clients in the 1960s to serving thousands of people at the beginning of this decade, the continuing demand underlines the importance of the service that is provided. I admire how Housing Rights has grown and adapted to meet the ever-changing needs and demands of our society. And over the years, you've seen the level of demand for advice on housing and homelessness issues increase. And in response, Housing Rights has been agile, developing new ways of working and embracing new technologies to provide the support that our communities need. And this was especially evident in the response that was provided throughout the pandemic. How you support those most in need is, of course, hugely important to me. This includes those who are unfortunate to be experiencing homelessness. And the cost of homelessness, both in monetary but also in societal terms, is massive. And in Housing Rights, you're a key partner as we try to make homelessness brief, rare and non-recurrent. I know Housing Rights are passionate about tenant participation, and this is something that I am committed to. You're advocates for lived experience being the basis for policy development, and I know that this will only enrich our policy work. I'm therefore delighted to hear that Renters' Voice are assisting the department with important research into letting agent regulation, and this will input into the Chartered Institute of Housing's wider research report and be used to help develop policy around letting agents. I take immense pride in the enduring relationship between the department and Housing Rights, and I'm delighted that despite budgetary constraints we have found a way to continue funding vital services. I know this enables you to leverage additional funding from a variety of other sources as well. I'm delighted that Housing Rights have recently been awarded a grant from the National Lottery Community Fund to expand the vital services that they offer to young people through their Housing Rights for Young People service. And I am fully behind any service which can help our young people sustain their tenancies and equip them with essential skills and support. This is another example of your ability to innovate and respond to a changing society. Housing Rights brings a unique contribution and perspective, and I believe your contribution will become ever more important as we continue to grapple with the many challenges we face across the housing sector. Housing Rights is a critically important organisation because for me, housing is a critically important issue. I believe that in the Department for Communities we have the building blocks which help people to create for themselves a good life. And I don't think that there is anything that is more important in that than housing. I believe that if someone has a good, safe, secure house to live in, it gives them incredible opportunities in which they can build their life. Giving a child a good start in a good home is absolutely foundational in terms of the health and educational outcomes that we want to see. It reduces the impacts on other departments as well, and it really does improve the life chances of people. And as politicians, that's ultimately what we're here to do. We're here to help in the ways that we can make people's lives better. And I'm absolutely committed and determined in my role as Housing Minister to make sure that we do all that we can to ensure that people do have those safe, secure, affordable and warm homes to live in. I look forward to working with all of you here to make that a reality over the coming years. But I'm very grateful today for the work that Housing Rights has done over the last 60, and I hope for many more years to come. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much for those remarks. Now, earlier I touched a little bit on the context of the earliest days of Housing Rights, but for a more comprehensive account of the history, we're going to hear from Rose Crozier, the Chair of Housing Rights. She's held that position since 2022 and has over 40 years' experience in the public sector, including roles as diverse as Head of IT and a Director of Neighbourhood Services. Rose, thank you.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, Minister, elected members, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. I think any declarations about age should stop here. I'm not saying anything. I'm, however, going to tell you how Housing Rights has evolved over the last 60 years. Hopefully the telling won't feel like 60 years, as I highlight some of our most significant milestones. 1964 has been mentioned already. That's where it all began. Out of concern for people affected by appalling housing conditions, local volunteers came together to set up Catholic Housing Aid, which worked to provide practical help to enable people to afford the deposit for a home. They became Belfast Housing Aid Society, and very soon were recognised as the place for people to get help with housing problems. As the decade progressed and the political situation in Northern Ireland worsened, Belfast Housing Aid supported more people who had been displaced and intimidated from their homes because of civil disturbance. The organisation's 6th annual report from 1969 shows that in the period from 1964 to 1969, the organisation went from advising 37 people to 1,294 households. During the first half of the 1970s, the organisation continued to focus on helping people with grants to buy a new home following intimidation. And in the early 1980s, as Belfast Housing Aid Services grew in response to greater need, The organisation worked with other concerned agencies to introduce important homeless legislation in Northern Ireland, which we still rely on heavily today. By the end of the decade, 80% of all mortgages were interest only, due to the popularity of endowment mortgages, and we all remember them. The 1980s was a time of reduced public expenditure, squeezed social security benefits, and high unemployment. So by the early 1990s, we had grown far beyond Belfast and were rebranded Housing Rights Service, expanding outside of our traditional advice-giving role with the establishment of a training and information unit. The housing market crash of the early 1990s saw an upsurge in arrears and repossessions, resulting in increasing numbers contacting Housing Rights for debt advice, and leading the organisation to employ its first ever specialist debt advisor to help save people's homes. After extending beyond Belfast in the 1990s, the 2000s saw our services reach more people in housing need and engaging with people who would have traditionally been overlooked. In recognising the many organisations we work with, it's clear how strategically important and integral our partners are to us, and none more so than the Community Housing Advice Partnership, or CHAP, which was established in 2003 with 12 other agencies from different locations throughout Northern Ireland. And today we support 51 frontline locations, helping other agencies to offer housing advice in their local communities through training, peer review and casework. In 2006, we founded a vital new service to help people entering and leaving prisons in Northern Ireland. The service was the beginning of an important and ongoing partnership between Housing Rights, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, Northern Ireland Prison Service, the Probation Board for Northern Ireland and NIACRO. We really value this partnership and are proud that the service has continued to innovate further and now includes a programme of peer advice provision within each of Northern Ireland's 3 prisons. It is worth noting the growing focus we've had to have on debt advice. As the first decade of the new millennium ended with the financial crash, we saw increased levels of personal debt, unemployment, and homes at risk of repossession. We experienced a 300% increase in demand for our specialist housing debt advice, for our housing debt advice service, formally launching our mortgage debt advice service in 2011. With such a major focus on policy and practice in this area, debt advice has become a critical service which continues to make a huge difference to all those who use it. As our tenant debt advice service grew in the social sector, we became increasingly concerned about the significant impact in the private rented sector, leading us in 2012 to set up the Private Tenants Forum, a group of private tenants who, using their experience of problems in the sector, work to influence decisions made by government. The Forum, who are now known as Renters' Voice, and we're delighted to see them represented here with us today, they continue to be a vital voice and a key stakeholder. Towards the end of the 2010s, concern was mounting about the impending end of essential mitigations to shield households in Northern Ireland from the harshest elements of welfare reform. Housing Rights, together with the Law Centre, co-convened the Cliff Edge Coalition, a coalition of over 100 organisations who campaigned for the continuation of the mitigations and to strengthen the social security safety net in Northern Ireland. Our partnerships continue to be as valued and important to us today, and it is a pleasure to see many of our colleagues who we have worked with through the years and continue to work with here with us to celebrate our successes together. And so far this decade, bearing in mind it is only 2024, we have braved a global pandemic followed by an economic shock, both of which have threatened to undermine how people in Northern Ireland enjoy their right to a home. All said and done, looking over 60 decades, it's fair to say that much has changed, but much has stayed the same. Housing Rights remains a values-led organisation which focuses on solutions. It remains an organisation that innovates and develops services which reflect the needs of people experiencing the sharpest edges of housing need. And whilst our services have grown, our influence has expanded, and our areas of expertise now reach further than advice. In looking to the future, it is important to acknowledge where we've come from and to pay tribute to all who have helped and continue to help us on our journey. It is reassuring that our raison d'etre can still be summed up in the words found in our 1969 annual report, which says, "If we were to describe the aims of the Society in a few words, we would say it exists to help people with housing problems." Thank you all for your attention.
Rose, thank you very much for that. And I think part of what we heard there really was how the history of housing rights is not just about the history of housing in Northern Ireland, it's about part of Northern Ireland's social history, really. We think about all the changes which have affected or afflicted this society being seen through that lens of housing, and we'll hear more about that later when we come to the book launch. Now, there are lots of people who've been involved in the work of this organisation over the years. It wasn't possible to capture all of them, but we are delighted that a few agreed to speak on their camera about their time. And we're going to see that video now. Thank you.
A lot has happened in the first 60 years of housing rights. We spoke to just a few of the people who've been involved.
In the post-war years, right up until the 1960s, the standard of accommodation in Northern Ireland was very poor. It was considered that 14% of housing at that time was unfit for human habitation, and owner occupation simply was not an option for most people.
In 1964, people like Frank Irvine, Willie McCormick, Paul Campbell and Patrick Hopkins were so concerned about housing that they set up Catholic Housing Aid, soon renamed to Belfast Housing Aid Society. These are the words of Patrick Hopkins, one of those founding members. "We discovered that a family could be housed with a deposit of anywhere between £50 and £100. £100 was a lot of money in 1964, and in order to raise the money for deposits, each of us asked friends and contacts for donations. People were very generous, and my own firm effort produced £200, sufficient to house 2 or 3 families. My colleagues were equally successful, and thus we started." The Belfast Housing Aid Society soon established itself as a go-to place for people in need of help with their housing problems.
I cut my teeth as a volunteer advisor in Belfast Housing Aid in 1980. In those days, there were over 10,000 homes that were either bricked up or not fit for habitation.
When I started work in Housing Rights Service, which was then Belfast Housing Aid in 1980, the rent order had just come into force, and this provision, which allowed considerably more repairing obligations to be enforced by councils, led to a great increase in demand for our services. But it was really up to Housing Rights Services advisors to be working alongside tenants and working with landlords to get conditions improved and to ensure that people had decent accommodation to live in.
In the early 1990s, inflation was very high. Mortgage interest rates were in the region of 15.5%, and the number of cases being taken to the courts for repossession because of mortgage arrears was rising rapidly. As a result, in response to client need, Housing Rights employed its first housing debt counsellor. People who attended court with one of our advisors had a much greater chance of saving their home than those people who didn't.
Over the years, the need that we were responding to ebbed and flowed. So sometimes we were working mainly in the private rented sector. Sometimes it was with homeowners facing repossession. Sometimes it was with people facing homelessness.
One of the keys to Housing Rights success was having the willingness to listen to its clients and the changing needs of its clients.
It was important to engage with specific communities. So we did this, for example, with ethnic minority communities through our Housing Champions project.
With its specialism in housing law, Housing Rights initially worked closely with solicitors outside the organisation to advance tenants' rights.
I was a solicitor in the Law Centre from 1990, concentrating on housing law, and through that I became involved with Housing Rights Service. For example, we worked on a case where tenants had been unlawfully evicted from their property. I, through the Law Centre, took a challenge to court. That decision was overturned, and we were able to use that to raise awareness among tenants of their rights and on landlords on the restrictions on their ability to evict people unlawfully.
So around the period of 2006, we had noticed an increase in the number of clients coming to us with very complex legal issues. We decided to apply to the Law Society of Northern Ireland for a waiver, and we were able to employ a specialist housing solicitor who took on cases that prior to that we would have had to refer out of the organisation.
While Housing Rights supports the immediate needs of clients, we also strive to achieve systemic change.
We were involved in the development of homelessness legislation, which until 1988 had not existed in the same way as it had in the rest of the United Kingdom.
So once devolution arrived in Northern Ireland, we set up our housing policy team and Housing Rights, and that gave us a real opportunity to work with local politicians to help to shape the policy agenda here and make things better for local people.
Certainly, when I was in Housing Rights, we were passionate in terms of finding strategic cases to make change for people, and I can list any number of changes in terms of letting fees for private renters, in terms of improving the rights for private renters with landlords, landlord registration, certainly in terms of homeowners and borrowers, people paying their mortgage, the Help a Court service, giving free representation. The Bank of Scotland case made significant impact all across the UK for borrowers because that successfully challenged unfair practice by a major bank. And additionally, the Prisons Project was started and is still going to this day, and that is so fundamental to preventing homelessness. That's about safeguarding homes while people are in prison or helping them access home when they're out of prison. So it's easy to be passionate about housing when you work for Housing Rights because it's absolute pleasure to make that change and to get the reward of keeping people in their home.
The hard work and vision of so many people has set up a great foundation for the next phase of our work.
People in housing need are lucky to have Housing Rights in their corner. And its work is important today as it was more than 40 years ago when I first started out as a volunteer advisor in Belfast Housing Aid.
So we've come from a small group of volunteers to a situation where it's enshrined in legislation that everyone in Northern Ireland who needs it can have access to independent housing advice.
I think it shows kind of the impact of Housing Rights that there's at least 3 people in that video that I've interviewed for the BBC at one time or another. And also, I do hope that Les kept that donkey jacket from the 1980s. So a lovely garment. We're now going to hear from 2 special individuals who've been working with Housing Rights to use their experience of poor housing and homelessness to make things better for other people. I'm going to call on Rachel Pearce, Housing Rights for Young People peer advocate, and Jenny Miller from Renters Voice, who are going to speak about their experiences and how they've shaped the work of Housing Rights.
Hello, my name is Rachel and I'm the peer advocate on the Young People's Project at Housing Rights. I was drawn to this role by my own experience of homelessness. At 8 years old, my mummy died. From then on, I stayed between different family members' homes, and while my family did their best to support me and my siblings, I no longer had a stable full-time home. I wouldn't describe myself as homeless because I had a roof over my head or a bed to stay in, but I have since realised that there's a big difference between having a house and a home. By the age of 16, I was sofa surfing between family and friends and living what professionals would call a chaotic lifestyle. In reality, this just meant that I had no stability or security in my life. I had started to use alcohol and drugs. My mental health was suffering. I was suicidal and often found myself in situations that made me vulnerable. I didn't want this life for myself and didn't choose this life. I felt as if this was the story I was given. I joined a local youth group called PYPD, a personal youth development programme. The workers in this group give me so much support and encouragement to improve things in my life. As well as supporting me emotionally, they also help me with practical things in order to get back on track. One of the things that they helped me with was my housing and completing a housing application. I knew that these were the steps in the right direction towards having a more settled life, but I could see from friends and family around me that this was no quick fix. People and families are on the housing waiting list for years before getting appropriate housing, and private rental was simply not affordable for me. It was hard and I often felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. Something else that the programme helped me with was looking for employment. At that stage in my life, I've been working in youth work since the age of 16. These roles were often low paid and lacked security. My support worker and I came across a job within housing rights. It was the peer advocate on the young people's team. I thought that my experience in youth work and my own experience of homelessness could be used to help others and make a change for more than just myself. The job description stated that the purpose of the role was to assist housing rights to achieve its vision of alleviating and preventing homelessness by providing advice and mediation on housing and homelessness issues affecting young people. This lit up a passion inside me and convinced me that this was a job for me. I felt I was at a stage in my life where I was prepared to start creating change along with other people in the same or similar situations. I wanted to be a part of creating a space where those with power and influence would listen to my experience and hear the voice of other young people just like me, because there are a lot of other young people in situations like mine, and sadly, many that are worse off. Since getting the peer advocate role, I've been involved in a lot of diverse work. I've been advocating for other young people and helping them to have their voices to be heard. I have provided advice and support to young people with housing issues. I'm also responsible for leading our young people's peer reference group, which involves reaching out to other young people experiencing homelessness and encouraging them to share their stories and inform us of ways we can change our service to be better. I think having a peer advocate role in this service is important because it allows myself and other young people to shape the service that they are receiving to best attend to their needs and make it more accessible. I feel that having similar experiences allows me to empathise with the clients that I work with and allows them to relate to me. I know from experience how intimidating it can be to deal with a professional that you feel is too formal or just doesn't understand. I talked with other people on my team about how they think having a peer advocate has helped shape our young people's work, and that they told me that I helped the project to be more client-centred and to look at cases from the perspective of young people. I've been directly involved in cases and brought a different perspective and my own experience. It would be easy to stand here and tell you how far I've progressed, that in October last year I moved into my own flat and that I'm continuing to work for housing rights and that that's my happy ending. But there's still many more hurdles that I need to overcome. I do have a place where I can call home, but I still face issues with my housing, such as issues with very long waits for repairs, damp, mould and the affordability of rent and rates of running a home. For the longest time, I was focused on getting my new home and breaking the cycle of homelessness. Now that I have my own place, I have realised that housing issues continue beyond homelessness and how important it is that young people experiencing all sorts of housing problems have access to advice and advocacy from people like me that knows what it's like to be in their shoes. This room is full of politicians and policymakers who work within the housing sector. I'm sure most of you encounter stories like mine every day. I understand from working in the sector myself how difficult that it can be, but you are the people who have the power to make a positive change. And my question to all of you is, what more can you do, or what can you do differently to make a difference to the thousands of people who are experiencing homelessness and housing issues that affect every single part of their lives? On the 31st of December 2023, there were 46,461 applicants on the social housing waiting list. Of these applicants, 34,651 were in housing stress. That's a shocking statistic. Some of you will have the power to change those figures, and some of you will have the privilege of helping and showing compassion to the individuals behind those statistics. Those statistics really matter, but so do the people behind them. So please, keep listening to their stories like you've listened to mine today. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, how do I follow that? Just sit down and go home. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, my massive congratulations to Housing Rights on your 60th birthday. What a testament to stood the test of time through so many societal changes and still be growing stronger. Incredible. And thank you to Housing Rights for the invitation to speak this afternoon. It's my absolute honour and pleasure and privilege to be standing here in front of so many illustrious people. I do know, however, Paddy Gray, that one or two of you won't be a bit surprised to note that I'm standing in front of a microphone with something to say for myself. My name's Jenny. I'm a member of Renters' Voice. I am currently reading for my master's degree in international human rights law, focusing on housing. So I just about fell off my seat when I discovered the Special Rapporteur was going to be here today. It was like, I am a homelessness support worker, but most importantly, I'm an expert by experience. I have lived through homelessness and housing stress myself, And I absolutely would not have achieved, I would not be standing here today without the support of Renters' Voice and Housing Rights. I first interacted with Renters' Voice at the beginning of the pandemic, having a few disabilities and health problems that led to me having to shield. And I found myself with an inordinate amount of time on my hands, which is never a good thing. On Facebook, there's a bunch of Facebook ads. Renters' Voice had asked for survey respondents for their research on renters' experiences during the pandemic. I responded, and being a nosy sort of a person, agreed to be kept up to date with what was going on. Subsequently attended a meeting fairly soon after that. 4 years later, you still can't get me to be quiet. It's never going to happen. So at that time, I was living in a house that I described as having had 2 showers. One of them was professionally installed. The other one came into the kitchen when any water upstairs was turned on, or just when it wanted to, at any stage. We had a jacuzzi in the kitchen at one stage. The stairs in the house were described by local councillors who were trying to assist us as being a literal death trap. The amount of injuries I sustained and my children sustained falling down these stairs was ridiculous, and the place was absolutely impossible to heat. But it was a roof over my head. It wasn't a hostel. It wasn't a car seat. It wasn't somebody's sofa. It was a roof. And one that I would have preferred, if I noticed the quit was to be issued, to have a little bit longer than what was then 28 days. You can't pack your life up in 28 days and move. So I quite heartily joined in the campaigns for our 6 months notice to quit policy request. This campaign and others have led us to giving evidence to the Department for Communities and playing a direct role in effecting the terms of the Private Tenancy Act 2022. The department now will find the department and other MLAs will actively seek out Renters' Voice for our views, and we quite happily give them whether it's what they want to hear or not. I have found privately now I do have a constant stream of political representatives, community representatives. You know, Jenny's become known as the housing person. So my focus would be really private renter sector. So as part of Renters' Voice, I've been really privileged to attend and speak at conferences. When my work road allows, I sit on the all-party groups on housing and homelessness as an observer and as a champion for change with Community Foundation of Northern Ireland. Innovative Solution, this is a mouthful, Innovative Solution to Housing and Homelessness campaign. Caffeine is my very best friend. Having thought my whole lifetime I would return to nursing, I soon discovered that actually my passion in life is housing. Basic, affordable, accessible housing. Basic human right. When those needs are met, everything else is so much easier. Health, studying, relationships, child development, it's all get me outside. But more importantly though, do you know I used to be really shy? Don't you laugh, Paddy Gray? My amazing colleagues at Renters' Voice and Housing Rights have taught me that I have a voice that's worth listening to, a voice that can advocate for myself and for others, a voice that can help bring change within the private rental sector, a voice that can use the trauma of the past to bring hope to others, the confidence to apply for my master's degree, and something even more precious than that, true friendships. I'm going to get all emotional. A group of people, I can't even look at them now, a group of people who celebrate the wins and commiserate with the misses, a group of people who are my ride or die, who encourage me with my decision to return to full-time employment, who genuinely care about my family, my living situation, our living situations, and that's priceless. So whilst not officially linked to Renters' Voice, it would be really remiss of me not to mention 2 staff members. I had a glorious collision of 2 worlds, part of the QUB Women in Law's mentorship. I shouldn't have looked at her. Housing Rights own solicitor Aisling Cunningham and her colleague Sarah, who have put up with incessant questions with me trailing behind them, wanting to know what's happening, what's going on, what do I do, why are you doing that? And they've willingly lent their expertise to help me further my knowledge. And without that, again, Ranters Voice, it just wouldn't have happened. So alongside the incredible support of Kate, I can't look at you, Christine, Kerry, Nolene, and I'm not going to start naming everybody because I'll forget somebody and then I'll not be able to ever go back again. But many of the amazing teams at Housing Rights and Ranters Voice, I just have two words that mean everything, and that's to say thank you. Thank you. So, thank you for believing in me. Thank you for believing in us. Thank you for believing in a better way of housing. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for those very powerful accounts. Can we get another round of applause, please? We come now to our keynote speaker, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, Balakrishnan Rajagopal. He is Professor of Law and Development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has held his UN role since 2020. He's travelled to Belfast from Washington and has spent the last couple of days meeting with senior political and government officials, as well as housing sector organisations, and most importantly, people with direct experience of poor housing and homelessness. And he's going to share his reflections on his visit and highlight international standards and good practices. Thank you.
Honourable Minister, elected members, distinguished guests, it's a privilege to speak to you today on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Housing Rights Northern Ireland. My warm congratulations to everyone at Housing Rights and to all those who contributed to its enormously important work, advancing the right to adequate housing in Northern Ireland. Most countries in the world are experiencing a situation of polycrisis, an intersection of multiple crises from security, political, economic, ecological, health, and social. A crisis of affordable housing amidst climate change is a major dimension of these crises and one that has an enormous impact on homelessness. Homelessness is a manifestation of these polycrises, but remains a problem which is actually within the power of most wealthy countries to solve. While there is a lack of reliable worldwide statistics, homelessness is a global concern in all world regions. For those countries or organizations that have made efforts to track various forms of homelessness, the figures are alarming. For example, according to the latest official figures of the USA, over 650,000 people were considered homeless as of 1st January 2023. That's more than a 12% increase from 2022. It should be noted that over 40% of them are people of African descent, who make up only 12% of the population. In most EU countries, homelessness has significantly increased since 2010, at least by 70%. The 8th overview on housing exclusion in Europe, published on 5th September 2023, by FIANSA, estimates that at least 895,000 persons live in Europe either in street situation, in emergency accommodation, or in accommodation for the homeless. In many developing nations, homelessness is either not surveyed or often the issue is named differently, but homelessness as a human rights violation is similarly persistent. The most common form is housing deprivation and exclusion, visible in the form of large, underserviced, poorly built, informal settlements, also called slums, often without access to safe water and sanitation and electricity, in which the residents frequently live in constant fear of forced evictions. However, other forms of homelessness exist as well in the global south, whether it is pavement dwellers, people occupying dangerous, often so-called unauthorized structures, or residing in IDP or internally displaced persons or refugee camps. As pointed out in the studies that we have seen over many years, in several countries around the world, large informal settlements house the most marginalized communities in the global south, who are at the highest risk of evictions and displacement. Although the right to adequate housing has been enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights since the 1960s, it is denied to millions worldwide who lack access to any form of housing or even shelter and are forced to sleep rough or in structures unsuitable for a life in safety and security. Homelessness is not only a serious concern in terms of the right to adequate housing. If you look at morbidity and mortality rates of persons in situations of homelessness and compare those with people who are adequately housed, the difference is shocking. The median age of death for persons in street situation has, in some industrialized countries, been estimated to be 49 years, over 25 years lower than for the entire population. There is no doubt that homelessness violates also the right to the highest form of attainable health, to water and sanitation, to privacy, and the right to life, which is more than mere survival, but includes as well the notion of a life with dignity. Failure of public authorities to prevent and address homelessness is a state failure to uphold the most essential elements of the human right to adequate housing and other fundamental human rights that everyone should enjoy without any discrimination. Unfortunately, too many countries fail to recognize or protect economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to adequate housing, whose denial is almost exclusively felt by the poorest and the most marginalized. Homelessness cannot be solved without recognizing and protecting the right to housing. In fact, if not in law as well. While the pathways into homelessness are manifold, it is possible to prevent, reduce, and end it, or at least reduce it to marginal numbers. This is particularly true for countries that have access to significant financial and other resources and have functioning public administrations. We saw how it could be done during COVID-19 pandemic. Regrettably, many measures, including anti-eviction measures, have all ended in most places, and we are back to square one. For those 13 European countries where there are more reliable estimates, the persons in situation of homelessness in Europe are of course still too many, but not so many that this problem could not be dealt with. Those in situations of severe forms of homelessness represent only 0.174% of the total population in these European countries. This surely is a solvable problem. For example, Finland has actually shown that reducing homelessness is possible by adopting a housing-led approach, providing affordable housing and, if necessary, additional ambulant social support, critically important. In 1987, over 17,110 persons were counted in Finland as homeless. The latest official figures from 2022 indicates 3,686% in various forms of homelessness, a reduction by 83%. Netherlands and Singapore have shown success by adopting a housing-first approach and by emphasizing prevention and care dimensions occasioned by homelessness. I'm encouraged by the fact that more and more countries have adopted national action plans to prevent and end homelessness or have started to undertake official data collection. 4 African countries initiated at the UN General Assembly Resolution 76/133 on affordable housing to end homelessness that was adopted in 2021. The UN Secretary General published in 2023 a comprehensive report arguing strongly for a human rights-based approach to prevent and end homelessness. I was privileged to be part of the Academic Council to that report. During its EU presidency in 2021, Portugal spearheaded the establishment of the European Platform on Combating Homelessness, in which all EU states agreed to work towards ensuring by 2030 that no one sleeps rough for lack of accessible, safe, and appropriate emergency accommodation, that evictions should be prevented whenever possible, and no one is evicted without assistance for an appropriate housing solution when needed. A major concern, current concern, in the global debate about how to address homelessness relates to the criminalization of homelessness. It has indeed been a particular focus of an ongoing campaign to end the criminalization of homelessness that I have embarked on together with the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Professor Olivier De Schutter. Regrettably, the use of criminal and administrative law to punish the poor, the homeless, persons with mental disabilities, and other persons considered to be different, unpleasant, or deviating in their behavior from the majority has a long and outrageous tradition. Colonialism helped to export vagrancy laws globally, such as the British Vagrancy Act, 1824. Many European countries introduced similar vagrancy laws which provided the legal basis to imprison so-called idle and disorderly persons, rogues and vagabonds, or incorrigible rogues, and subject them to forced labor or intern them in so-called workhouses. Regrettably, the development of international human rights law did not immediately result in the discrediting of vagrancy or other laws, criminalizing persons experiencing homelessness or poverty. The first international human rights treaty, for example, that came into force after World War II, the European Convention on Human Rights, includes still in Article 5, paragraph 1E, on the right to liberty and security of persons, a provision allowing for the lawful detention of, quote, persons of unsound mind, alcoholics, or drug addicts, or vagrants, end of quote. In 1971, the European Court on Human Rights ruled in the so-called vagrancy cases that the detention of the applicants in vagrancy centers in Belgium, where they were made to work in exchange for payment at a low rate, was neither a violation of the right to liberty and security of person, nor a violation of Article 4 of the same convention prohibiting slavery and forced labor. In the United States of America, it was only in the early 70s that a succession of vagrancy laws was ruled unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court, although life-sustaining activities like sleeping or cooking continues to be criminalized by local jurisdictions or state laws. Germany's Constitutional Court ruled only in 1970 that begging and vagrancy should not be criminalized. Finland's 1883 vagrancy law was only repealed in 1987. Belgium abolished its laws against vagrancy and begging in 1993. In Greece, a provision in the Penal Code on vagrancy was repealed in 1994, while begging was decriminalized only in 2018. In Argentina, a police edict on vagrancy and begging was declared unconstitutional in 1995. In Mexico, there are still laws and regulations in force prohibiting begging, eating, sleeping, or performing personal hygienic activities in all or certain public places. Allegedly, they are not enforced. As most of you know, there have been several attempts to repeal the Vagrancy Act in England, Wales, and Scotland that have served as a blueprint in so many formerly colonial countries. While Scotland managed to repeal this law in 1982, in 2022, this infamous act was formally scrapped in England and Wales as well, although the repeal lacks an implementation date, and there are many concerns that some form of criminalization of vagrancy or associated behaviors will continue. Indeed, this archaic law is still being used to arrest many people. More than 3,800 homeless persons have been arrested in England and Wales since 2018. More than 1,000 homeless persons have been arrested for sleeping rough or begging since the UK government pledged to scrap the act. The scrapping of Vagrancy Acts, the amendment of penal codes and judgments by constitutional courts regrettably do not mean an end to the criminalization of homelessness or sanctions and punishment for performing life-sustaining activities in public through local bylaws. In fact, in countries such as Switzerland, several cantons reintroduced and expanded laws prohibiting begging. Hungary reintroduced the criminalization of persons experiencing homelessness in 2018. In the United States of America, many cities have made efforts to circumvent the 1970s judgment of the Supreme Court by criminalizing homelessness by adopting regulations that are considered to meet the requirements of US constitutional law. Many Western states and cities in the US are currently engaged in a constitutional tussle before the US Supreme Court in the case of Grants Pass versus Johnson, challenging a Ninth Circuit ruling which had held criminalization of life-sustaining activities of homeless persons to be a violation of the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. It prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. This is also a case where I have submitted an amicus curiae petition before the Supreme Court. As far as Africa is concerned, the campaign to decriminalize poverty and status made a comprehensive submission to me covering 19 African countries, indicating that in most of these countries, vagrancy laws dating back from the colonial period are still in force. In South Asia, anti-vagrancy or anti-beggary statutes were adopted during the colonial period and are systematically used to hound and harass the poor who lack adequate housing and income. All of them are fundamentally inconsistent with modern human rights norms, including the constitutional jurisprudence of their own courts. At the UN, the guiding principles on extreme poverty and human rights, as well as the guidelines for the implementation of the right to adequate housing, recommend that states should prohibit and address discrimination on the ground of homelessness or other housing status and repeal all laws and measures that criminalize or penalize homeless persons or behavior associated with being homeless, such as sleeping or eating in public places. In June 2020, the Human Rights Council of the UN in Resolution 43/14 called on states to take all necessary measures to eliminate legislation that criminalizes homelessness. While the UN General Assembly adopted an important resolution on homelessness, calling homelessness an affront to human dignity in 2021, and reiterated the same resolution in 2023, the resolution unfortunately remains silent on the issue of decriminalization of homelessness. Given the continued difficulties to decriminalize homelessness and petty offenses at the national, local, and international levels, the contribution of regional human rights mechanisms to overcome the use of criminal law for petty offenses must be lauded. The principles on the decriminalization of petty offenses in Africa, adopted in 2017 by the African Commission on People and Human Rights, the advisory opinion of the African Court on Human Rights, Human and People's Rights, adopted in 2022, which states that various vagrancy laws, which continue to be enforced in many African countries since colonial times, are incompatible with human rights law binding on their states. The ruling by the European Court of Human Rights in 2021 in the case of Lakatos versus Switzerland are examples that could be noted here. Despite these judgments, criminalization of homelessness remains a serious concern in Europe and elsewhere. For example, on 2nd February 2022, the Danish Supreme Court sentenced a Lithuanian citizen to 60 days unconditional imprisonment for begging. Since 2017, changes in the Danish Penal Code have contributed to increasing criminalization of the presence of homeless persons in public spaces. Strongly condemned by their own civil society, the inhumane policies introduce restrictions on sleeping rough and increased punishment for begging. There is prima facie a strongly xenophobic element to this legislation in Denmark. In debates introducing the new sanctions, it was openly stated that the aim of these policies is to target non-Danish citizens living homeless on the streets of Denmark. The figures so far confirm this as well. For 94 convictions under paragraph 197 of the Danish Penal Code, 91 were of non-Danes. Finally, as a recent report of a fellow UN rapporteur has pointed out, more clearly than any other publication so far, homelessness can be a pathway into contemporary forms of slavery and sexual exploitation, and that there can also be the reverse risk that persons subjected to contemporary forms of slavery may be at increased risk of becoming homeless. Labor and sexual exploitation may leave individuals trapped in housing without any security of tenure, where they can be quickly pushed into homelessness. The threat of homelessness is usually a core part of the system of enslavement. For example, through slave labor like labor exploitation, agriculture, or domestic work. Often those subjected to such exploitation are housed as well by those exploiting them. If the concerned individual wants to flee the exploitation, they have literally no place to go and no access to any alternative housing that they could afford. They are trapped in continued exploitation. If they want to exit their exploitation, they end up on the street, which in turn may keep them trapped in slavery or be sent to jail under the wave of criminalization. Therefore, much more needs to be done to ensure that, for example, domestic and migrant workers have security of tenure that is independent from their employers. Regulations must ensure that those housed by their employers as part of their working arrangements cannot be pushed into the street when their employers end their work contracts at short notice. As the world witnessed during COVID-19 outbreak in many countries, employers of migrant or domestic workers literally overnight ended their contracts for assistance workers or servants, resulting not only in sudden job loss and loss of income, but in loss of housing, sending domestic and migrant workers to the streets, often unable to return to family members or foreign countries. The gender dimension is critical and central to this issue. The more visible street homelessness is in most countries 60 to 80% male, while homelessness itself is not. In particular, women, girls, children, and LGBTQ youth usually avoid as much as possible the so-called street or unsafe homeless shelters. Homelessness then takes the form of couch surfing or doubling up with other people, sofa surfing as it's called here, I guess. Homelessness then takes the form of, as I said, these forms of doubling up with other people, friends or relatives or whoever may be willing to host the distressed person. These living arrangements hardly provide any security of tenure, and hosts can kick people into the street in a matter of minutes or hours without breaking any national law. This comes with alleviated risk of exploitation, whether labor or sexual exploitation, forcing women, girls, and youth including LGBTQ youth, into unwanted relationships or other forms of exploitation. Relationships under duress may be maintained to have roof over the head, but do not provide a safe, secure place to live in dignity. This form of homelessness is hardly visible, receives much less attention, but can be as rights violating than having to survive on the street as a rough sleeper. It may be even more difficult to escape and is more difficult to monitor and measure. Many support services that have been established to address street homelessness do not offer adequate support and housing solutions for people trapped in this form of hidden homelessness. In the presence of these and other pervasive challenges raised by homelessness, I applaud the important work done by Housing Rights Northern Ireland and strongly endorse their advocacy for prevention of homelessness, including through legal guarantees. Northern Ireland has other special challenges in meeting the right to adequate housing as well, including spatial segregation between communities and discrimination, especially against travelers, inherited from its historical past. None of these are impossible to overcome, as I have suggested here. Many countries, including some in Europe, have indeed done so. Indeed, Northern Ireland has proved its ability to collectively meet its challenges by ending conflict and paving the way for a better future. I encourage a whole of government approach to the promotion and protection of the right to adequate housing, a strong foundation in law, including prevention of homelessness, and a focus on addressing structural causes of the challenges to the right to adequate housing, including access to land and a democratic and community-centered approach which encourages experimentation. I wish you all my very best and pledge my support as UN Rapporteur to support your efforts in every way to promote and protect the right to adequate housing. Thank you.
Balakrishan, thank you very much for that global tour, really, of the issues, and there is much there we want to pick up on in the Q&A. Before we come to that, we're going to hear from Kate Macaulay, the Chief Executive at Housing Rights, a position she's held since February 2023 after joining the organisation in 2015. And she is going to be looking very much to the future with the new strategic plan, people, prevention and partnership. Kate, thank you.
Thank you, John, and a huge thank you to the speakers that we've already had today. It's been fantastic to be joined by our Minister, by our event sponsors and by so many of our elected representatives. I took so much, and I hope you did too, from Mr Rajagopal's remarks. I took so much energy and so much inspiration from the real bravery and leadership from Rachel and from Jenny as well. I think I probably have the toughest gig today to follow all of them, so I'll keep my remarks quite brief. But it's really with huge pride in where we have come from and a really determined focus that we must once more put our shoulder to the wheel that I want to speak with you just for a few minutes about the next phase of our work over the next 5 years. I hope that in the time ahead you will take the time to read our strategy. I hope you'll take the time to read the report which accompanies it, which talks about how we engaged people who have experience of housing problems and homelessness and how that shaped our thinking. For now, though, I thought it would be most helpful if I told you why we decided to call the plan People, Prevention and Partnership. And it's not just, although we do like alliteration, but it's not just because of that. It's because it gives you the best sense of what our approach will be in the next 5 years. So people, you've heard a few times already today that the work of this organisation is and always has been shaped by the priorities of the people who need our services, and that will not change. Today, our work shows us that more people are having difficulty finding and keeping a home that they can call their own. Our advisors tell me that there is greater distress, more widespread vulnerability in the people who need our services. And all of this in the context of huge challenges for our housing system and what feels like fewer options available to help people. So our new strategy commits us to working hard to make it easier for people to access independent quality housing advice to help them. We understand that we must design services around people to promote choice and improve access. This has already defined our approach to our digital strategy, where we have opened up new channels for people to contact us, and it's an important driver for our participation work. We value the insights that only people with direct experience of poor housing and homelessness have. We know that our decisions are better when we have a more complete range of expertise at the table. And we're always among the first people to call for policymakers and decision makers to do this. So it is absolutely right that we prioritise this in our own work. We're delighted that so many people from so many diverse backgrounds, including those who had used our services, and to be quite frank, those who had never heard of us, helped to shape our strategic plan. We're proud, as you heard from Rachel, that the next phase of our work with young people will see us appoint young people to a peer reference group to influence the development of that service. And we know that in the next 5 years, our work in this area will help us shape better, more inclusive services. For us, people is also about our team, our staff, our board, our volunteers. I can't tell you the privilege it is to lead such a committed team of experts who put themselves at the service of improving lives right across Northern Ireland. In the next 5 years, we will support a culture that values our people through development and well-being and fosters innovation and leadership. Prevention. You may have read the report from the Law Family Commission and Civil Society, which was released last year. It talks about a vision of a country where a greater proportion of society's problems are stopped before they start. It talks of a people who, when faced with crisis, can emerge from those crises more swiftly and less affected. That is our vision for society too. And it's why our new strategy commits us to prioritising homelessness prevention and to ensure that where this is not possible, we work to make the experience of homelessness rare, brief and non-recurring. We want to build on our strength and expertise in shaping innovative prevention-led services to target those communities most in need. As you've heard today, our peer advice model has benefited people in prison custody and people from our minority ethnic communities. Our community housing advice model ensures that people accessing community advice services in communities far beyond our offices on the Newtownards Road have expert help and a gateway to further support. We are an independent charity with limited resources, but our strength is in our closeness to the experience on the ground and that we are trusted to help people with their housing problems. In the time ahead, we want to make sure our services continue to find their way into communities that need us most. We are especially committed to exploring how we can best serve the housing advice needs of our traveller and newcomer communities. Our new strategy is also about strengthening the evidence base for change. We want to make better use of the data and insights that we hold. We'll invest in better systems and processes to make it easier to see, analyse and tell the story of the people who use our services. And we'll use this evidence to support policymakers and legislators to solve problems. A problem we're all concerned about is the impact of climate change and how we can support the transition to homes which are greener and more sustainable whilst also being genuinely affordable and free from cold and damp. At Housing Rights, it was insights from our work that told us that the worst problems were in the tenures that policymakers find the most complex to map the route to net zero. And that's why we've recently commissioned research to shed light on how to move us forward in the privately rented and low-income homeowner sectors. And lastly, partnership. We are so delighted to have so many of our partners across community and voluntary, government and private sectors here with us today. Our partnerships are and always have been really important to Housing Rights, and it is right that they are given prominence in our strategy. We know and are proud of our reputation as a committed delivery partner for government in our work with the Prison Service, with the Department for Communities, the Housing Executive, and in the courts with the Legal Services Agency and the Department of Justice. We're also really proud of our role in the community and voluntary sector, with advice partners in the broader housing and social justice movement. In the next 5 years, we want to strengthen our work together. We are social value focused, and we know that we can achieve more by working collaboratively. It's our values that shape our approach to partnership. And I hope that when you look at our values and our strategy, you recognise those as defining features in how we work with you, our trusted partners. In concluding, you will have heard already today that housing rights is and always has been a service that is shaped by the people who need and use it. I think I'd actually go one step further than that and say that it is a service that belongs to those people. On the wall above my desk is a quote that many of you will recognise. It predates even housing rights, and it's from 1958, and it's from a speech given by Eleanor Roosevelt that I thought was pretty appropriate today, given that we have Mr. Rajagopal with us. She asks, where, after all, do human rights begin? In answer to her own question, she says that they begin in the small places close to home, and that unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. I've always drawn a really straight line between the idea of rights beginning in small places and housing rights' vision of when everyone has a home. The work that we are all doing shows us how true it is that unless we have a stable, safe home, our well-being and our enjoyment of other rights to health, to education are all weakened. So thank you for sharing our journey so far, and I look forward to working in partnership with you to focus on people and prevention, and to ensure that housing rights, as well as human rights, are real in the small places close to home.
Kate, thank you. What a perfect note to end on, I think. That leads us on to the Q&A. I will join the top table for that. We will have a couple of roving mics, so you can stick your hand up if you have a question. I do have some questions about those small places, as well as some of those bigger global themes. So I will just dash across here and we'll get underway. I suppose, Kate, if I could start with you. We have a Stormont budget. We have some form of programme for government in the works. Do we have a sense yet of where housing sits in the context of the budget and the programme for government?
I see you're saving all the difficult questions to the end. My hope is that the programme for government absolutely prioritises housing. I think that we hear so many warm and very welcome statements from our elected representatives about the importance of housing, about its centrality in the work that we are trying to achieve across government and across sectors to promote well-being and to improve people's lives. So I very much hope, and I'm always optimistic, that housing will be a central priority in our forthcoming programme for government. The budget is very difficult, and every conversation I have starts with things are very bad, things have never been quite this bad, and we don't have the resources that we need to continue to do the work that we want to do. And you'll have heard earlier this week stories about the pressures on temporary accommodation and about the huge impact that that is having in terms of costs and pressure it's putting on government and on services here in Northern Ireland. I suppose there are different ways to look at it, and because I'm an optimist and because I want to solve problems, I think about the price, the cost of homelessness. I think about the cost to the public purse, and I think about the cost to people, to families, to relationships and to society. And one of the reasons why, John, we have recommitted ourselves to focusing on prevention is because we know that when we intervene at an earlier stage, we not only save people from the damaging experience of homelessness, but we also save the public purse. And I think that now that things are so bad, that things have never been so bad, that should be the motivation that we need to start doing things differently. And I think now there's an opportunity in that. We have spent, and Mr. Rajagopal can share his reflections on this, we've spent the past 2 days meeting with decision makers, meeting with people who have influence and people who are affected by the issues. And I think there's a real sense of pragmatism, there's a real sense of being solution focused, and there's a real sense that we need to do things, we need to work in partnership, we need to focus on prevention, and we absolutely need to prioritise people and keep that central in our thinking.
Very good. Balakrishan, if we stick maybe with the note of optimism for starters, you know, your global view there, where are the places where things are being done well, where we can draw lessons from? You know, you mentioned briefly the Netherlands and Singapore, and do you get any sense of the things which are being done well here, which other people could learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a few examples. I think there is more being done in, as I said, more resource-rich places. I think on the other hand, even with countries where the resources are not as much, especially given the magnitude of the challenges they face, there are examples of countries that have really forward-looking legal and institutional structures and highly mobilized local communities that are working in partnership with and are not afraid to go up against their governments. And that produces significant change. And a primary example for that I've studied over many years is Brazil. Very forward-looking policies to a variety of issues, starting with the constitutional framework on property rights. They took the 19th century German idea that property is not simply a matter of rights, because when we say property ownership, we always talk about the right to exclude, the right to sell, the right to this and that, but not about obligations. But the 19th century German idea was that property has a social obligation. And that idea that property has a social obligation found its way to Latin America. And from the Mexican Constitution of the 1920s, it found its way to many Latin American constitutions, and Brazil incorporated that in 1988 after the fall of the military regime. And they have done some significant policy and institutional work based on that one thing, which also kind of brings me back to institutional and legal factors being so important to clear the way for alternative practices to grow. Because if you're stuck with old institutions and laws, sometimes it may be very hard to overcome them, because you can have all the ideas, you can have mobilization, but eventually somebody is going to kill the idea, you know, with the idea that it's not consistent with our system of government or our legal system. The legal arguments turn out to be extremely difficult to overcome. And I also want to say that the other thing that gives me a great deal of optimism and hope is not just some examples from foreign countries, but the level of civic engagement and sacrifice and optimism that I sense here in Northern Ireland, starting with groups such as housing rights. I mean, I don't know of many groups that work on housing that have hit a 60-year landmark around the world, actually. That's phenomenal. And everyone I talk to who work with communities, whether it's the travelers or youth experiencing homelessness or others, I sense a great deal of commitment, a desire to make change. And ultimately, you sense whether a place is possible, whether it's possible for a place to evolve towards a more, better future, to have that optimism, is in fact sensing that on the ground, and I do sense it here strongly.
Well, the sun is coming out as you say that, which is very good. But before I open this up further, I think what we heard there was quite important. Is about the need for the legal underpinnings. Where are the gaps, would you say, in the legal underpinnings in Northern Ireland currently, and is there any plan to address those?
I think in Northern Ireland, because of the nature of our kind of stop-start government, we're very far behind legislation in other jurisdictions. And being an optimist, There's an advantage in coming last. There's an advantage for us in learning from the experience in other places. And I suppose the very obvious gap when we talk about the need to prioritise prevention of homelessness is that in other jurisdictions across the UK, there are laws, there are duties which require and facilitate public authorities to prevent homelessness. There is no such legislation here in Northern Ireland. And I think there's an opportunity for us now to look very carefully at the different models that have been used elsewhere, think about how we can ensure that we not only bring forward the right model of legislation, but that we bring forward a model of legislation which can actually deliver on the ground. So it's really important that whatever we bring forward, that there is the resources to be able to deliver it. And I think in some of the conversations that we've had today, Raj has talked about the experience in other jurisdictions and about how important it is to have the right architecture in place, then to have the right legislation in place, and then to have the right policies which flow from that. I suppose as a policy professional, that makes a lot of sense in my head. And it makes a lot of sense to me because I've seen so many policies which say we want to prioritise homelessness prevention. And there's no one in this room who doesn't want to prioritise homelessness prevention. But what holds us back is because we are dealing with all the things that we have to do. And once we've done all the things that we have to do, there is very little space and very little resource to do the things that we want to do as well. So I think there's an opportunity now for Northern Ireland to look at the other models that exist, think about what might work here, and then think about a plan for properly resourcing that and ensuring that it's made real on the ground. Because it's important not just for policy development, but it's also important for people to have the right to a remedy. And we see that all the time in our work, where the weaknesses in our legislation here frustrate attempts to make things better. So I think that there's certainly a piece of work, and I'm kind of inspired. Always look for inspiration in other countries. Really inspired by the work that was done in Scotland when the Scottish government asked Crisis, the charity Crisis, to set up a review group to involve government and other stakeholders right across the community, and also to involve people who have lived experience of homelessness as well, and to look at what improvements needed to be made to Scottish legislation around homelessness. And I think that mechanism for involving people, for bringing the right people to the table, for looking for the best expertise, and for thinking through some of those really challenging questions about how we do this and how we do it well, I think that model, that mechanism, is a really useful one for us to consider in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Stick your hand up. We have a gentleman at the back, and then down the front here.
Hi, my name is Brian Payne. I'm a journalist with View Digital. First of all, I'll say I've covered a lot of housing rights stories over the years, and so congratulations. And now the question. Page 9 and 10, which is the challenges we face. You can see they're really considerable. They're huge, massive. And all these people affected by these, they lack housing rights. I mean, the rents, the homelessness, etc. You know, that's a huge swathe of our population. So just on the area of private rents, would you support, because calls have been made in Scotland and England, whatever, would you support calls for price control, rent controls being issued in the private rented sector? Thank you.
Okay, we'll come to that in a sec. We'll just group these questions. We'll take this one here as well.
Hi, it was great to hear you say that there seems to be an appetite amongst MLAs, ministers and policymakers in order to change policy and legislation in favour of keeping people in their homes and giving people homes. Do you feel that there is also an appetite to put that into action and make sure it actually happens and it doesn't just become lip service as the current policies are?
So 2 questions there. One on whether the MLAs have any more than honeyed words, which we'll deal with quite quickly. And then a more complex question from Brian, thank you, which both of you may want to deal with, this thorny issue of rent caps or rent controls. Do they work? Can they be made to work? Can they be counterproductive? So we'll deal with MLAs first. Do you get the sense that this is actual, people are prepared to walk the walk here?
Absolutely. I get such a strong commitment from our MLAs. They're problem solvers. They are as frustrated as many of us are. I've spent today with members of the Communities Committee. I actually had to tell them, I'm really sorry, we have to leave. They're so passionate about achieving change. I think the challenge for the rest of us is to ensure that we are allies in that we work to support our leaders, our elected representatives, that we bring forward the best evidence, that we provide constructive scrutiny, that we provide an accountability role, and that we bring forward and be brave enough to talk about our experience and to provide that. And I think that's the type of work that I'm really proud that Housing Rights does, that we're always solution focused. We don't just point out the problems, we try to bring forward solutions as well. So yes, I absolutely think that there is an appetite, which is fantastic, but the challenges are immense, and that takes me on to Brian, your question. Brian, firstly, thank you for reading the strategy. I hope you get beyond the challenges. That they are immense, you're absolutely right. And in the private rented sector, affordability is the #1 issue that people contact us about. So absolutely, I think there needs to be consideration of models which would make affordability in the private rented sector a more realistic and more achievable gain. I suppose that has to be balanced with our reliance on the private rented sector. We've seen an influx of private landlords leaving the market, and that created homelessness. So it's a tight rope to walk to improve regulation in the sector, whilst also ensuring that we are able to maintain supply in the sector. But I think I hope that there is an appetite within the department to look really seriously at these issues. We get very positive noises when we talk with decision makers about the challenges of affordability. I think it's very welcome that Local Housing Allowance has now been realigned to the bottom 30%. It's not enough. We need to do more. We have a discretionary housing budget in Northern Ireland, which is in huge demand. And I suppose I think there's an opportunity actually to look at issues around rent levels and how we can ensure that they are kept in a more affordable space in the conversation around climate justice and in the conversation around just transition. I think government will need to consider very seriously how we implement changes for private tenancies, how we can bring those homes up to standard, how we can retrofit them. And many landlords that I speak to talk about the challenges that they will face in doing that. I think they recognise that that's important, but there are huge challenges there for them in doing that. And it's one of the reasons why we've commissioned a piece of work to look at what might tip the balance, what might actually work for people, because I think we always have to be looking for opportunities to deliver better housing outcomes. And I look at climate justice and the issues around just transition as an opportunity to refocus minds on the affordability challenges and on the poor housing condition challenges in the private rented sector.
We'll maybe get back to climate before the end, although it's a huge topic which you could take a whole day on yourself. But firstly, the global experience of rent capping or rent controls, what's the evidence? What do we know?
Well, a kind of a professorial nerdy answer is that much of the literature on rent control is either produced by economists or it's produced by those who look at the lived experience of communities that are rent overburdened and what happens to them. So they tend to be mostly sociologists. But if you look at these two literatures and you look at the published evidence on rent control, the general sort of thing you can say about that is that the mainstream economics technical opinion is that rent control mostly doesn't work. But they also come with a lot of limitations, particularly two limitations. One is that they have two assumptions usually in the literature on that says eventually that rent control doesn't work. But these two assumptions don't hold good in most contexts. One assumption is that the housing supply, physical supply, is at or near saturation point. And secondly, that the income levels of people who may be entering the market is on a more sort of there is quite a lot of inequality. If those two assumptions hold true, then in such a market, imposing rent control may turn out to backfire in particular ways. But these two assumptions also turn out to reflect the particular markets. There's the economist study, which tend to be either the New York market or the Chicago market. An overwhelming amount of literature on rent control is produced by microeconomists writing on New York market. And they get published in all the major economics journals, and people read that, oh yeah, rent control doesn't work. But it's a very peculiar market, New York market, and you can't generalize from that at all about the rest of the world. That's one thing I want to say. But, you know, just from a human rights law perspective, I just want to say that rent control, you know, is not only acceptable as a way to bring about access to housing, adequate housing, it may in fact be necessary for many states to engage in rent control. Having said that, I think it depends on context. What works in terms of rent control in one location, we shouldn't assume that it works everywhere. So it's something you have to approach on a case-by-case basis. The two other things I would say is that I think part of the problem is the way we talk about rent control as rent control or rent cap. We can always reframe it as profit control or profit caps. They're not rent control, they're profit control, really. I mean, it's not as though the landlords who actually receive rent in a situation where rent control is imposed are deprived of all rent. They are entitled to a reasonable return on rent, but there is no unlimited right to profit from your property rights. That's basically what it is. It's a limit on profits, basically. It's not a limit on rent. And so I think activists and others need to also learn to reframe the debate. As, for example, a law on rent control could be reframed as a law against usury, for example. It's an old idea. It's been banned in law and morality and religion for a long period of time. Why not reframe it as usury? The other thing I would say is that rent control, the practicalities of rent control are very important because you can't just introduce a law on rent cap or rent control and expect it to work, because it depends on a number of other legal and institutional changes that need to be made to bring about its actual operationalization. For example, a couple of years ago, Berlin, in a referendum, voted for a rent cap. It was struck down by the German Constitutional Court as unconstitutional. Why? Because did the Constitutional Court say that rent control can't be imposed because of property rights? No. Instead, the Constitutional Court said that rent control can't be imposed by Berlin under Germany's constitutional system because of the federal division of powers between city governments and other levels of government, particularly Länder, the middle level government, which also raises the issue of what are the legal responsibilities and rights of local governments? Because often, almost always, rent caps or rent controls are imposed by local governments. So if you want the city council here, for example, in this city to impose rent control, I would say don't just pass a law on rent control, also study how the issue of what local governments are entitled to do under the British constitutional system has been treated by courts. Because otherwise, you can pass something and then a higher court is going to strike it down, really. It's not going to go anywhere. It'll be the Berlin, rather. So the other thing that's very important is taxation powers. It's very important to be able to provide adequate changes to taxation laws that provide the ability to operationalize rent control financially. And in fact, these are practical suggestions that I put forward when in California there has been a debate which is picking up steam quite a bit to constitutionalize right to housing and particularly introduce rent control as a strategy to achieve that. And I propose some of these as a way to operationalize it. So those are kind of a long meandering way to answer this question, I guess. So.
Thank you very much. Now, I am not going to ask. I'm not going to ask the question on climate because it's just going to we'd be here for an hour. I'm sorry. I know you both mentioned it, and it did feature a little bit, but you know, there's clearly an enormous challenge there among the many others we have. Now, before we get to the wine, we have the launch of a fabulous, handsome book, which is a potted history of housing rights, and therefore, as I said, a history of modern housing in Northern Ireland, as well as one of social and political change. It's been edited by Sharon Muldoon, former long-serving member of Housing Rights staff. I'll ask her to say a few words by way of introduction.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks very much, everyone. Yeah, as John says, there's wine waiting, so I won't keep you too long. I'll be quick. Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words about the 60th anniversary book, which we're launching today as part of our celebrations. So I've worked at Housing Rights on and off since 2000 in a variety of roles. And so it was a great honour last year when I was asked to carry out research into the history of the organisation. We thought it was important to record for posterity its rich history, showing the reasons for its establishment back in 1964 and how it developed into what it is today, all against the backdrop of what was happening not just in housing, but in wider society. There was no expense spared, and my research took me to such exciting places as the Public Records Office and the newspaper library. It's really sad, but I actually did find it exciting. It was fascinating to get my hands on a bundle of papers at the Public Records Office, dating from the late 1960s and the early 70s, with some of the content still redacted. That was really exciting. I was like, what is this? So these documents were redacted because it included people's names. It was the names of people who had applied for financial help because they were being intimidated out of their homes right at the beginning of the Troubles. So even in those early years, and while relying heavily on volunteers, the then Belfast Housing Aid Society was asked to carry out the administration of those applications from intimidation victims on behalf of the government. But my own personal favourite discovery was an article from a newspaper called the Irish Weekly and Ulster Echo in 1964. And that had a photograph from the inaugural meeting of the organisation, and it's in the book. And, you know, I was shocked actually to see that photo. And I thought about, you know, if those people were here today, what would they think? You know, that 60 years on, this organisation has achieved so much and will go on to achieve more. So finally, I would just like to thank everyone who helped in developing the book, especially those people, some in the audience, who took the time to put into words their own experiences of being involved with housing rights throughout the years. Hopefully I didn't badger you all too much, especially for photos, which no one likes. But that's really all I want to say. I hope that you enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it. And I hope you enjoy the wine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sharon, that now brings the formal part of the proceedings to an end. Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you for everybody who spoke to us, particularly the rapporteur and also Rachel and Jenny. The book is available down the back, as is the wine, so please enjoy. Thank you and have a good evening.